Sorry, it's thinking about it. There we go. Okay, it's doing it. All right. So Melody Andrews, thank you so much for letting me interview you today. One of the things I wanted to ask you was, why did you make the switch from public relations to teaching English language arts?
So I wanted to have more of an impact in terms of seeing an immediate impact in the work that I did. And so even when I was doing communications work or public relations work, I was really interested in the way that it impacted communities. And so one thing that I think is important is literacy. And that was really something that inspired my switch.
Literacy.
Yeah.
So how does your background as a public relations professional inform your experience as an educator?
So it really does inform your experience because it, as a public relations professional, you learn how to communicate with different audiences. And if we think about our students as those different audiences and the way that we have to differentiate within instruction, it's kind of the same thing for crafting a message or a lesson for what will be most impactful for your students. So it's a similar practice in terms of pivoting information. And so that has helped. And then also being able to share with students the best way that they can communicate, whether it's through their writing, whether it's through their speaking, whether that is in a disciplinary literacy sense in different subjects, or even within the context of just understanding what is the right writing situation when they're writing essays. So that's how I see it really intertwining together.
So in this year of unprecedented events that have altered education for students, what practices do you think will be adopted as permanent? How do you think this year has changed education as we know it?
So I think something that is going to stay is the use of technology in terms of platforms like Schoology or Canvas. I know a lot of schools are using that, or Blackboard. So I think those things will stay because it makes content accessible for students in terms of students who may be absent or sick or have to take leave or things like that. So it does make it more accessible for students to catch up, if that makes sense. But I also think that there are other strategies should be adopted. So in terms of like how we're creating students to, or hoping that students have 21st century skills, I think it's really important for students to have access to technology, because those are things that are going to also be necessary if and when they go to college or in the workforce as well.
Have you seen any disparities or have experienced the disparities that students may have because of those who have easy access to technology and Wi-Fi and those who may not?
So this is my first year at my current school at Marshall High School. And so Marshall was a one-to-one prior to the pandemic. So that meant every student had a device already. Having worked at a school in schools before that kids did not have that access, and it was not an affluent school or an affluent district that could not necessarily provide students that access, it is a big difference between who's able to have access and who isn't. And so I know, talking to some of my colleagues that work at schools that I used to work at, all of their students don't have access to devices this whole school year. Some students were able to get Wi-Fi hotspots, some students were able to get laptops, others weren't, because the school and the district just did not have the funding to provide that for all students. And so those disparities are pretty wide. And I think we make the assumption falsely often that because within our DMV bubble, most people have access to things, well, not even DMV, Northern Virginia, most people have access to internet and things like that. And that's just not always the case. I'm sure if we looked at districts just in this area, students within DCPS or some districts in Maryland, or even some that are further south in Virginia, don't have that same access.
Do you see that becoming a priority in terms of the year that we've lived? Schools are so cash strapped,
Mhm.
then make schools
Mhm.
beginning to make that a priority in terms of getting folks not only the computer literate, but the access to the technology to have that in the event that we have
I
to
think it
do
should
something
be.
like this again, or
Yeah, I think it should be a priority, but whether or not it ends up being a budget priority, it definitely should be. But I just think if it just depends on the context of where people are, if that's actually something they can bring to reality. But I do think it's an opportunity for districts to build partnerships with these corporations and companies to possibly, um, possibly mitigate some of that cost, if that makes sense.
yes, yes. So tell me, what keeps you in the field of English, in terms of education and English language arts?
Can you repeat the first part of the question? I don't think I
Sure.
heard you.
What keeps you in the field of education and particularly English language arts?
Oh, that's a good question. So, particularly English language arts, I love to read and I love talking about reading and writing and literature. And so, because I'm passionate about that and I would like to see students be passionate about that, that keeps me there. And then also, I definitely have a passion for making sure students are able to see themselves in the literature that we read and teach and making sure that that's inclusive. So, I know when I was in high school, I didn't always, majority of the characters and authors that I read in high school were white men. And so I think it's able to be able to provide students with that experience where they're like, hey, there is somebody that looks like me who wrote this, or, the character looks like me, or the character has a family that's similar to mine. And so being able to provide that diversity as well.
How much flexibility do you have in terms of picking the texts that you're able to share with the students?
So within Fairfax County, like we have, so like at our school, we have books that are approved for like the units. So the novels are selected, but you could always supplement those. And we have a book approval process as well. So a lot of what was already selected was fairly diverse. So I feel blessed in that way. So I didn't have to do all the heavy lifting by myself.
That's good.
But being able to supplement was helpful as well.
That's good to hear. I know at George Mason University, there's a strong emphasis in social justice and teaching through a social justice lens.
Mhm.
I think nearly every class I've had, we've been encouraged to focus on social justice and
Mhm.
as a unit. How easy is it to tackle those subjects under a county system?
It's not easy, but I don't think doing advocacy work is ever intended to be easy. So I do think it's something that you do have to prepare yourself. And when I say it's not easy, it may be easy in terms of having the support on a leadership standpoint, right? But sometimes it's emotionally taxing to do that work and have those conversations. And so it is something that you also have to be aware of where you are and how you're feeling and taking care of yourself as well. Because I think so often when we talk about social justice leadership or anti-racist teaching or what's the other one? Anti-bias teaching or abolitionary teaching, the whole range of that is a thing that becomes it just becomes a little bit challenging, especially as a Black Indigenous person of color, doing that work, because often it will feel like you're doing it by yourself because you won't always have colleagues who understand or who, and sometimes you'll have, they're children, we have students who don't understand it. So you're having heavy conversations and that could be difficult, but it's necessary work. And I think the important part is just taking care of yourself and checking in with yourself to make sure that, you know, or that's one thing that I do for myself is making sure that I am ready, prepared, mentally okay to have those conversations. Because even with current events, there are some teachers that can go in a classroom and ignore that there was a mass shooting that morning or the day before and just teach, right? I can't do that. But at the same time, I have to check in with myself to make sure that I am okay as well.
So I guess that leads me to my next question. You sort of alluded to it a little bit. You know, you are teaching students who are starting to develop opinions, either form, you know, whether they were influenced from the family or their friends or from what they're seeing. How do you become impartial, or how do you manage the various opinions that may surround an issue of social justice that may not align with you, that may not be in the popular societal beliefs that kind of run contrary? How do you become then sort of like almost like an impartial facilitator to this issue, which, you know, is hard because obviously
it is hard.
Everyone has an opinion on something like this.
Right. So one thing that I do is I set up just kind of in my classroom, a culture of inquiry. Also let them know that I am also learning. So if I hear or see an opinion that is contrary to my own, that is not necessarily offensive, because if it's offensive, I will check you. So, but if it's something that is just kind of like I don't agree with, right? So I'll give an example, not a real example, but an example. Let's say global warming, okay?
Okay.
And let's say there's a student who doesn't believe in global warming, asking questions about, well, why don't you? You know, why do you think this isn't a focus? And just having that conversation and asking those questions. Another way or strategy that I often use is I believe in leading with the data and the facts. So as much as I love to teach literature and talk about books and writing creatively, also informational texts that are from credible, non-biased sources, introducing studies, infographics, things like that, that kind of show students that, oh, like this is a study that, you know, this is the data on this. So although you may not believe that there is racial bias or marginalization or police brutality, if you're presented with the facts in this text, it's not me saying it, the text said it.
Yeah.
And so that is one way to kind of negotiate and navigate that, where it's like, I'm not disagreeing with you. You know, your analysis will lead you to that.
Very good. All right. So what are the most rewarding aspects of teaching English?
What was the most what aspects? I'm sorry.
Rewarding aspects of teaching English literature.
Oh, okay. So I have students who are like, I hate reading. And then they read something. They're just like, oh my God, that was kind of cool. I like that, you know, or this was fun. Like, that's always like, those resistant students are always the fun part, because it makes you feel like, yes, I've won you over. That's part.
What do you find are the most discouraging aspects of your role as being an educator?
So this is going to be a twofold question. So the not deep answer is having to put in grades. I hate doing that. I get so annoyed with putting in grades. But the inequity that you see and the disparities that you notice, and you're like, it can be so simple to fix, but there's this system that's, you know, involving in this bureaucracy that doesn't necessarily make it easy to fix. And so that is discouraging often. And then also the reality is you can't save everybody, right? So I teach high school. These, like you said, they have their own opinions, ideas. I can't necessarily change or win over everybody.
So what suggestions do you have for teachers who are looking to enter the profession at this point?
Have a great self-care plan. Leave work at the end of the school day. Don't take anything home with you. Even if you have to do it, just do it the next day. It'll be there. And, just know that you do the best you can, as long as you're trying to do the best that you can, because a lot of it will make you feel like you're being a bad teacher.
What important issues face English teachers today?
Oh, I would go back to that literacy piece, because so many people think about literacy as in terms of reading and not like reading, writing, speaking, listening, right? Some people are just like, oh, I have to know how to read. And it's like, no, it's a whole spectrum of literacy. So I think that is one of the hardest parts.
So in terms of, as a teacher, education's important. Your students are learning. You're always learning. How do you keep up with the profession and changes? What texts do you read? What do you do in terms of staying atop of your profession, and particularly English language arts?
So being a member of the National Association of Teachers of English is helpful, or National Council of Teachers of English. I probably said it completely wrong, but that's helpful in terms of best practices. So, in part of teacher Twitter or teacher Instagram, and seeing some of the conversations there. From a scholarly perspective, the American Education Research Association journals are really helpful in terms of education issues on a broader spectrum, kind of throughout the pipeline to college. And so all of those are different ways that I stay, those are pretty much ways that I stay abreast of what's happening.
What do you wish
outside of my district?
Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine.
What do you wish you had been taught when you were as a student, as you were pursuing your education in teaching, that you feel like would have made your education, your preparation as a teacher complete? Was there anything lacking? Was there anything missing?
That's a good question. I would say I wish I would have had more understanding and context as a teacher during my teacher education program, of not just like teacher oriented instruction basis, but also understanding the organizational structure of school systems. A lot of teachers don't understand that, but it's something that dictates a lot of what happens to teachers. Unfortunately, I eventually learned that, but I just think that would have been more helpful in terms of me understanding that, like, hey, yeah, the principal told you to do that thing, but you can't be upset with the principal because his boss told him, and his boss was told by the state. So it's like understanding that chain of command would be very helpful, I think, for aspiring educators, for sure.
Now you're working on a PhD. Where do you see the direction of your career in education going from here on out?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I just had a meeting about that yesterday, and I was just like, everything seems like an option. So here's where I'm at with that today on April, what day is it? April 9th.
Yeah.
So where I see that is probably going into education leadership in terms of instruction, and eventually going into teacher education in a school of education. So that's where I'm at with that today. That may change.
No, I think that's
But, yeah.
exciting. Well, I want to thank you for your time. I'm enjoying
Thank you.
watching or seeing all the techniques that you're doing in terms of online teaching. I have to say, I'm going to pause this now. I'm going to stop recording. I have